Hello, hope you're all well. I am talking from Brazil, and as you can see on the screen, my name is Clarissa Jordão. I have to start on a sad note, I'm afraid, because I cannot stop from acknowledging the violence, both physical and symbolic, suffered in this Brazilian territory in the past and still perpetrated today, when we're having to deal with the threat of a health crisis among the poorest and daily attacks from an authoritarian government to our fragile democracy and diversity. That being said, I'd also like to thank Sharon for organizing this conference and for keeping it alive in times of death. Thanks, Sharon. And thank you all for watching this that I see as some kind of a forced relief from my worries with what's going on in Brazil right now. Before I start my presentation per se, I would like to call attention to the word regional in the program for this part of the conference, because for me, everything we say and do is always localized in our regionality. So I guess I'm finally ready. So what I'll do is I'll first let me share my screen with you here for the slides. So, yes, here we go. Right. So, what I'll do is I'll first talk a little bit about how I see my locus of enunciation, that is, the context I speak from, including my theoretical perspective, you know, and when I look at it, especially when I look at internationalization of higher education, and then briefly refer to one initiative that has inspired my research on internationalization of higher education in Brazil, and mainly in terms of my methodological approach to the research. So I am from the tip of Brazil, the end tip of Brazil to the south, where we have parallel systems of private and public higher education. And by public, we mean totally tuition free. I come from one of these public universities that is almost entirely funded by the federal government, where I work in the area of applied linguistics, the subfield of language teacher education, with English as a lingua franca and decolonization alongside Southern epistemologies. So I have been thinking about internationalization based on the Latin American modernity coloniality group that includes Mignolo, Grossfogel, Escobar, and others, and their idea that modernity and coloniality are two sides of a same coin. So for me, coloniality is not only a historical moment, but it's mainly a group or an assemblage of onto-epistemological practices that constitute our subjectivities and social structures. So in order to think about such structures, I use Boaventura de Souza Santos, especially when he looks at modernity as being regulated by three principles: the state, the community, and the market. And he says that the market has, especially in the last 40 years, the market has taken absolute prominence. So the state itself has been regulated by the market in a neoliberal fashion, rather than the other way around. And this, of course, has huge implications to higher education, as Boaventura describes in his book published this year called The Cruel Pedagogy of the Virus. I brought you a quote that I think is worth reading together. So he says that state itself and civil society have been managed and evaluated under the logic of the market and by criteria of social capital profit. That is how public universities have been subjected to the logics of capitalism, with universal rankings, proletarianization of research and teaching productivity, and the conversion of students into consumers of university services. So this allows me to look at education as a whole, but especially to higher education as being a colonial project rooted on capitalism and patriarchalism, a project that has been extremely violent to our local epistemologies and ontologies, that is, to our onto-epistemologies, as I see both ontologies and epistemologies as interdependent. And such a project has been silencing and invisibilizing our local ways to construct knowledge. As a colonial project, then, education has been helping to construct and reinforce the existence of a global North and a global South. And the internationalization of higher education has also, more recently in Brazil, highlighting the abyssal line that invisibilizes local onto epistemologies and therefore promotes the global North as the center of scientific knowledge, of truth, of value, of power. So we kind of need to arise from the ashes we find ourselves buried into. And I think that this can be inspired by what Oliveira and Candau, two Brazilian decolonial scholars, describe as a decolonial project. They say that that a decolonial project, as they envisage such an endeavor, proposes an epistemic turn that is able to produce new knowledges and another symbolic understanding of the world without losing sight of the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. So for them, a decolonial project is the construction of a new epistemological space that includes subaltern and Eastern knowledges in a tense, critical, and more equalitarian relation. So in the area of language studies and applied linguistics, where I come from, therefore, such a project would mean moving away from a monolingual orientation to English as the language of internationalization towards a notion of translanguaging that sees language as a social practice and therefore as constitutive of the self, both the individual self, which is always social in the Bakhtinian sense, and the collective self. So this movement can be done in the process of identification and disidentification with the world and different ways to read it and different knowledges. So in terms of the monolingual orientation to English, in the internationalization of higher education, for example, a decolonial project would need to start from examining the violence that there is in the normativity of a standard language variety, for example, and also of native speakerism that places idealized language users as the owners of their language, and us, non-native speakers of English, for example, as having to follow the norms constructed by a minority of speakers that we believe this language belongs to. So this ideology of native speakerism and standard normativity is made possible by one of the main, I think, constructs of modernity and coloniality, that is the construct of separability, which has also been a foundation of scientific knowledge. So this binary thinking that isolates reason from emotion, that separates nature and culture, that has isolated languages as if they were independent, that has abstracted languages from context, isolating structures and separating language from its everyday existence. So this is kind of a method for desiccating a dynamic entity such as language, so that we can understand it. It is a method of, it's like taking language to a lab and analyzing parts of it, pieces of it. And it has proved this analytical way to work with language has proved inefficient, especially to deal with communication and meaning making in so-called real life. So in applied linguistics, many of us in Brazil have been resorting to the concept of repertoire in order to grasp how meanings are created, produced, attributed to texts. We have been resorting to the idea of assemblages of meanings, which is the idea that language repertoire brings some sort of relationality to the fore and focuses on how people use the resources they have available in order to construct meanings. So when we translanguage in internationalization, therefore, we move away from the analytical abstractions of modern science and gaze into the world as being constituted by assemblages of embodied connections and indisciplined or transdisciplined approach, an indisciplined or transdisciplinary approach, never, of course, losing sight of our locus of enunciation as a way to turn the certainties of modernity into moving sense. So when I look at internationalization of higher education critically, I am bringing together the concepts of decoloniality and of repertoires in translanguaging and devising basically two initial movements that I think we cannot do away with. The first one is the recognition that we are implicated in the violence of modernity when it desiccates languages that constitute us into smaller parts and then loses sight of the relationality and interconnectedness of body and language, for example. And two, the need to look for an alternative to method rather than alternative methods to make science, to relate science to people, to understand interconnectivity, and to keep diversity alive. We also need to be constantly reminded, I think, that both these movements will and do face strong resistance, both from ourselves as we are constituted by modernity and from institutionalized knowledge, which is a kind of knowledge that usually cannot envisage other forms of meaning making than the ones it has already legitimized. But I think there have been attempts to do things differently, besides our own attempt here in this conference. And I'd like to mention one of them briefly here. There is this Brazilian institute called The Color of the Letter, A Cor da Letra, that, inspired by the work of Paulo Freire, has been telling stories in and with underprivileged communities in Brazil. So they assume that that narratives are fundamentally important. They're crucial in people's lives. And by telling and discussing various stories, from fairy tales to chronicles, with these communities, they help them build some sort of a sense of identity, and also helps them share their identity building processes with one another in a kind of adaptation from Paulo Freire's circles of culture. So this has been helping people to understand who they are becoming, where they came from, and which possible futures are available for them. So I am inspired by their work with narratives for my own research on how internationalization has been affecting professors and university students, with the special focus on language and on English as a medium of instruction and as a lingua franca or international language. So I have been asking my research participants to tell me their stories, their tales of relationship with the English language, and how, and I have also shared some of my stories with them. And I guess we're all learning from and with each other. So my time is up. So I would just like to finish with Freire, our great master of education and critical pedagogy. And as he has put it once, num país como o Brasil, manter a esperança viva é em si ato revolucionário. So let's go on with our revolutions. Thank you very much.